All right. So tonight I just want to discuss the uh, reading for today, Leviticus 13. It is regarding the laws about leprosy. Now, before I dive into this chapter, let's just have a quick review of the book of Leviticus. So Leviticus is part of the Torah, so it's the law that the Jewish people used to kind of govern themselves. But this was not God's intention. These laws were actually kind of guidelines that God gave to the Israelites of ways to live to be pleasing to him. And also this will then guide them spiritually and morally and make them a holy nation as he has told them to be. So as we look at all the various different parts of Leviticus, we will see that at every chapter heading, it will give us an idea of what kind of part of the law are we looking at. Are we looking at the law regarding murder? Are we looking at the law regarding leprosy? Are we looking at the law regarding animals, the laws regarding the way that we live with our neighbors and such and such and such? And then it goes also into property. And so you can see God meticulously planned a way that people can live together that will be pleasing to him, but then also will have them living in harmony with one another. All right. So let's have a read through Leviticus 13. And I'll just, for the sake of convenience, read for us. All right, sorry. Everything that I just quickly said that was actually on my slide there. So as you can see there from my notes, so these guidelines covers also the way that we worship God, and of course then cleanliness, because these people are now living in the desert and they're going to be living as foreigners in the land until they established cities and such. So cleanliness actually had a huge part in this. But at the end of the day, these instructions in Leviticus aims to establish a holy community that reflect not just what God would have to be a satisfying community for himself, but then also will at the end of the day reflect his character. All right. So we read in the beginning, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron. So Lord capital, so it says Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, when anyone has a swelling or a rash on a bright spot on his skin that may become an infectious skin disease, he must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons who is a priest. The priest is to examine the sore on his skin, and if the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is an infectious skin disease. When the priest examines him, he shall pronounce him ceremonially unclean. If the spot on his skin is white, but does not appear to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest is to put the infected person in isolation for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to examine him, and if he sees that the sore is unchanged and has not spread in the skin, he is to keep him in isolation for another 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to examine him again, and if the sore has faded and has not spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a rash. The man must wash his clothes and he will be clean, but if the rash is spread in his skin after he has shown himself to the priest to be pronounced clean, he must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine him, and if the rash has spread in the skin, he will pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious disease. So I'm just going to stop there. Basically what I'm doing is breaking up into different sections. You'll see there's kind of a common theme in these sections. So basically now we're talking about a type of eczema, a rash that appears on the skin. And God meticulously already gives Moses and Aaron the guidelines on which they need to use to determine whether this is a life-threatening disease or if it is just a mere rash, and then also how to deal with it. And it's very interesting how God then gives them an instruction that if this person has this rash, then that person needs to be isolated. Why? Because it's an infectious disease. So if he goes and walks around the camp and he carries this disease with him, then he's going to spread it like a wildfire, and then everybody else is going to have this infection. And if this infection is life-threatening, then there will be a major loss of life. But if you can isolate this person out of the camp, then it will keep it contained, and it will then not spread through the camp like a wildfire, and it will preserve the community's life. So it is a kind of a very important piece of information that Moses and Aaron is given here. And you will see that is kind of a common theme throughout the whole of Leviticus. God is very meticulous and very careful in what he tells the people of Israel. So when we look at this, we can see that God is giving them this instruments of how to determine. He's talking about if it's skin deep, if it's not skin deep, if it's got white hair, if it doesn't have white hair, if the sore has turned white. So it is very detailed, the way that God is describing it. And then we, of course, then see that he goes into isolation for 7 days, and then if it remains for another 7 days. And if we listen to our medical practitioners today, normally when it comes to infectious diseases, there's an incubation period, and that incubation period is either 7 or 14 days, or sometimes it's 24 hours. But in this case, God has then told them, okay, when it is for these skin diseases, this is the way I've designed it. It will be either 7 days or it will be 14 days. And if it lasts longer than that, then this is a very big problem. And then you need to keep him in isolation, either till he dies or till he heals. But either way, he needs to be then kept away from the rest of the people, because he can put their lives in danger. All right, let's carry on to the next section. From verse 9, it says then, when anyone has an infectious skin disease, he must be brought to the priest. The priest is to examine him, and if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and if there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He is not to put him in isolation, because he is already unclean. If the disease breaks out all over his skin, and so far as a priest can see, it covers all the skin of the infected person from head to foot, the priest is to examine him, and if the disease has covered his whole body, he shall pronounce that person clean. Since it has all turned white, he is clean. But whenever the raw flesh appears on him, he will be unclean. When the priest sees the raw flesh, he shall pronounce him unclean. The raw flesh is unclean. He has an infectious disease. Should the raw flesh change and turn white, he must go to the priest. The priest is to examine him, and if the sores have turned white, the priest shall pronounce the infected person clean. Then he will be clean. So we get this kind of idea that we're talking kind of like about a blister here. So if he has these bumps on him and it is white, it means that it's contained and it's not a problem. But if you have like one of these skin diseases that causes, like blisters to form on you, the moment that it pops, that is when it's very infectious. And that is also when infection on that wounds are very prevalent, and then once again can cause greater havoc within the camp. So once again, the priest can keep him as he is as long as those blisters or those bumps are white and intact. But the moment that the skin breaks and there's raw flesh now exposed, then that person immediately needs to be pronounced unclean, and most probably they will have to then also put him in isolation. Now, it does not say here, and there's probably a good reason for that, but it's not mentioned within these few verses. All right, so let's continue on. Let's see what else we can learn from this part. So from verse 18, then it says, when somebody has a boil on his skin and it heals, and in the place where the boil was, a white swelling or reddish white spot appears, he must present himself to the priest. The priest is to examine it, and if it appears to be more than skin deep, and the hair has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious skin disease that has broken out where the boil was. But if the priest examines him and no white hair, and there is no white hair in it, and it is not more than skin deep and has faded, then the priest is to put him in isolation for 7 days. If it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is infectious. But if the spot is unchanged and has not spread, it is only a scar from the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. When someone has a burn on his skin, lost my place there. When someone has a burn on his skin and a reddish white or white spot appears in the raw flesh of the burn, the priest is to examine the spot. If the hair in it has turned white and it appears to be more than skin deep, it is an infectious disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious skin disease. But if the priest examines it and there is no white hair in the spot and it is no more than skin deep and it has faded, the priest shall put him in isolation for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine him, and if the spreading in the skin, and if it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious disease. If, however, the spot is unchanged and has not spread in the skin but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scar from the burn. So that is actually a great information that God is giving now to Moses and to Aaron, especially with regards to the burns. Now, if you have ever been a victim of quite a serious burn, especially if you have been around motorcycles in your life, or if you have dealt with warm metals, or maybe by accident you got doused with boiling hot water, you will know that the one thing about that burn is that it must be treated in a way that it remains closed, because the moment that you expose that wound to the outside air, it becomes infected, and that is very dangerous for the person, and they can often suffer from septicemia. So God is not isolating that person in this case for the sake of the community, but for the sake of himself, because if he is exposed to the various different environments, then that person's life can actually be in great danger thanks to the wounds that has been inflicted on him caused by the burn. The same with the boil. The boil is actually a big sore, and when it opens, it is very susceptible to infections. So it's not really like an infectious disease, but it is a sore that got infected and can become a bigger problem if it remains exposed to the outside environment. So we can see that God is once again being very meticulous, very detailed in the way that he is instructing the Israelites in the way that they need to conduct their own wounds. That comes back now to that first part that I said about the cleanliness that God wants to keep within the camp. All right, carrying on. If a man or woman has a sore on the head or on the chin, the priest is to examine the sore. And if it appears to be more than skin deep and the hair in it is yellow and thin, the priest shall pronounce that person unclean. It is an itch, an infectious disease of the chin or head. But if the priest examines this kind of sore, it does not seem to be more than skin deep, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest is to put the infected person in isolation for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore, and if the itch has not spread and there is no yellow hair in it, and do not appear to be more than skin deep, he must be shaved except for the diseased area, and the priest is to keep him in isolation for another 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to examine the itch, and if it has not spread in the skin or appears to be more than skin deep, the priest shall pronounce him clean. He must wash his clothes, and he will be clean. But if the itch does not but if the itch does spread in the skin after he is pronounced clean, the priest is to examine him, and if the skin has spread, if the itch has spread in the skin, the priest does not need to look for yellow hair. The person is unclean. If, however, if the judgment is unchanged and the black hair has grown in it, and the itch is if, however, in his judgment it is unchanged and black hair has grown in it, the itch is healed. He is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. When a man or a woman has white spots on the skin, the priest is to examine them. If the spots are dull white, it is a harmless rash that has broken out on the skin. That person is clean. When a man has lost his hair and is bald, he is clean. If he lost his hair from the front of his scalp and has a bald forehead, he is clean. But if he has a reddish white sore on his bald or forehead, it is an infectious disease breaking out on his head or forehead. The priest is to examine him, and if the swollen sore on his head or forehead is reddish white, like an infectious disease, the man is diseased and unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean because of the sore on his head. Now, if we listen to the kind of things that happen here, it doesn't sound like textbook medical things that we see and hear of happening today. But we can understand that, these people are living in a desert. They don't have access, to flowing water and cannot bathe as regularly as they should. Now, normally they did not bathe very regularly. It was once a week or once a month kind of situations. But in this case, it is possible that, especially now, if we listen to the last part of this, where the man is turning bald and he's clean, but then if he has this red spot on his head and his hair is getting lost because of that, that could be a form of mange that people actually were susceptible for. And that is something that is very infectious, because if you have seen animals that live in the same camp and one has got mange, then they actually infect one another. And then at the end of the day, your whole herd or the whole pack or whatever grouping of animals it is, will all be then infected with mange at the end of the day. So it is kind of important that they then are separated, and then of course they need to be washed quite regularly. But now, because they can't be washed, the best way to get rid of it is then to shave the areas and then to treat it then as best as they can with oils or whatever medical implements they have available to them at the time. It is actually very hard for us to kind of perceive the medical knowledge that they had back then, because we are so used to the 21st century, where you can walk to the pharmacy, you say to the pharmacist, my toe itch, then he will say, is it a raw itch or is it just a red itch? If it's a raw itch, you get athlete's cream. If it's if it's just a dry itch, he gives you aloe vera or something like that. So, we're living in a time where medical advice and medical assistance is freely available across the country and across the world, for that matter. But for these people, they did not have that access. They did not even have a doctor. That's why they had to really rely on the priest. And that is why God gave this specific, meticulous information to Aaron and to his sons, so that they can then administer this advice that God has given them, and to keep a person in isolation for the greater good. So we're almost done with this chapter. It's only got 10 verses left. So let's just dive into this last little part. So the person with such an infectious disease must wear torn clothes, let his hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of his face, and cry out, unclean, unclean, as long as he has the infectious disease. As long as he has the infection, he remains unclean. He must live alone. He must live outside the camp. If any clothing is contaminated with mildew, any woolen or linen clothing, any woven or knitted material or linen of wool, any leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination in the and if the contamination in the clothing or leather or woven or knitted material or any leather article or is greenish or reddish, it is a spreading mildew and must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the mildew and isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to examine it. If the mildew has spread in the clothing or in the woven or knitted material or on the leather, whatever its use, it's a destructive mildew. The article is unclean. He must burn up the clothing or the knitted or the woven material of wool or linen or any leather article that has been in contamination. Sorry, excuse me. Excuse me. All right. But if when the priest examines it, the mildew has not spread in the clothing or in the woven or knitted material or the leather article, he shall order that the contaminated article be washed. Then he is to isolate it for another 7 days. So, sorry, I'm just going to finish this part because it's still part of the previous discussion. So after the affected article has been washed, the priest is to examine it. And if the mildew has not changed its appearance, even though it has not spread, it is unclean. Burn it with fire, whether the mildew has affected one side or the other. If when the priest examines it, the mildew has faded after the article has been washed, he is to tear the contaminated part out of the clothing or the leather or the woven or the knitted material. But if it reappears in the clothing or in the woven or knitted material or the leather article, it is spreading, and whatever the mildew, whatever has the mildew must be burned with fire. The clothing or the woven or knitted material or any leather article that has been washed and is rid of this mildew must be washed again, and it will be clean. These are the regulations concerning contamination by mildew and in woolen, linen clothing, woven or knitted material, or any leather article for pronouncing them clean or unclean. Okay, so what we can gather from Leviticus 13 is it is procedures for recognizing various different diseases and also what could be causing it. We have now read specifically about skin diseases, and it's actually very interesting because it says it is the chapter for leprosy, but leprosy is never mentioned in this chapter. But most of the time, skin diseases back then were mistaken for leprosy because the people did not have the medical texts that we have today. So if a person had this itch or dry skin or sores, they would think it was leprosy and then cast this person out, because if he has leprosy, he's going to be infecting everyone around him. So that's why God then gave them this instruction. Send him first to the priest. Do not just exile the person, because there are rashes and there are open sores and there are burn wounds and there are articles of clothing filled with mildew that can cause rashes. But at the end of the day, let the priest then discern what is the actual cause of the problem. So they can recognize it, and then they can then identify it through the priest, and that will then give them the proper restraints of isolation. The priest will then determine whether it's necessary for isolation, if it's a 7-day isolation, a 14-day isolation, or an indefinite period of isolation. And at the end of the day, this will then teach that specific generation, but then future generations to come, how to deal with oils and burns and swellings and sores and baldness and all of that. So how do we apply Leviticus 13 to modern day faith? Well, the ancient laws may not directly apply to modern Christians, but the underlying principles of holiness and communal well-being and spiritual leadership are timeless. At the end of the day, we as a community need to be very close-knit and look after one another. And even though we don't live in such a close proximity where we can see what type of sores the other person is growing on their arms and legs, we can kind of through conversations determine that a person might be suffering or might need some spiritual guidance. And then we need to be able there to step in for them. And even though we do not have a high priest, we all kind of called to do pastoral work and to be kind of like the modern day priests for one another. When we look at the New Testament, it pursues us as well to look for inner purity. And, you know, as it says in the Bible that we kind of need to be a set apart community from the rest of the world. And this can only be obtained through our faith in Christ, who is now our high priest. So whenever we have afflictions and whenever we have problems and whenever we find ourselves in difficult situations, we can bring this sore, this skin rash that we have in our lives to the high priest, and he can then examine it. And it's also the importance that we need to be supporting and caring for one another in our faith community, but not just in our faith community, outside of our community as well. Yes, we need to be set apart from each other, but we're also instructed then to go out and preach to the world and to help them find this inner cleanliness and peace that can only be obtained through baptism in Jesus Christ, our Lord. So in conclusion, Leviticus 13 provides insights into this ancient Israel understanding of cleanliness and holiness, and the role that the priests have in maintaining the well-being of the community, be it not just spiritual, but also physical. And through its detailed instructions, this chapter serves as a reminder of the importance of both our physical health, but also our spiritual health. So in our contemporary context, we can reflect on these principles and seek to live in a way that honors God and promotes the well-being of our communities. So what I would like to do now is to open the floor for discussion, and then maybe we can just basically throw around some ideas of how we can use also this idea of a spiritual cleanliness and basically bringing ourselves before the high priest in a way that we can help one another to understand it and to also find ourselves being then ceremonially clean in front of God.